Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. And all the way from Minnesota in the USA, I have Steve Blue. Steve is a been there, done it CEO, and he's the CEO of Miller Ingenuity. Business transformation is Steve's thing. And there's a wealth of experience that we can tap into with all the different jobs he's done and the people he's worked with and the CEOs he's been. So, Steve, lovely to have you on the podcast.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, well, it's great. So let's begin by telling how your business now and in the past helps leaders and teams. How do you help them?
Well, I help them in a number of ways. One, I do a lot of keynote speaking addresses, generally to CEOs. I've done those for the CEO Clubs International. I've spoken at the Harvard Law School, United Nations, Carnegie Hall, Vistage International. And so one way I do that is I talk about my experience as a CEO and how fellow CEOs can turn things around. And I'm basically a transformational expert, and that's what I teach CEOs about. The other way I do it is through my books. I've written 5 books. One of them was a bestseller, and I'm actually on my 6th, which will be published later this fall, that I co-authored with Jack Canfield of Chicken Soup with the Soul. So that's kind of the 3 ways I do it. And I draw upon my experiences. I'm not necessarily that smart, but I've been around a long time. So there's very little I haven't seen. I tell CEOs all the time, you don't have a problem I haven't already seen. In fact, you don't have a problem haven't already solved.
That's great, and I'm particularly taken by you working on your 6th book with Jack because I've listened to a few of his audiobooks over the years, and well done for doing 5 and now doing the 6th. I'm about to produce my 3rd book, and
Oh,
it's gonna be CEOs and teams inspiring leadership, and it will have quotes from leaders like you because it's making use of the
good.
350 podcasts that I've done so far and your top tips. So I'm looking forward to doing that in the next 8 months. Um, let's talk about, the topic is inspiring leaders. And when you and I were chatting before, Steve, I said to you, who would be a couple of people that you'd call out as CEOs, current CEOs now, who have the qualities that you personally see that make them inspiring leaders. So would you just tell us about Nick and Rochelle?
Yeah. Nick Nanton is the CEO of a number of companies. DNA Films is one, and he also has a company, I don't quite remember the name of it, that helps people like me, smaller market CEOs, entrepreneurs, helps them to raise their visibility in their profile through, book deals, through film deals, through all kinds of stuff. And it's a very successful company. I've done business with them for maybe 10 to 15 years. But that's not the most important thing about what Nick does, Jonathan. The most important thing is he funnels the money from the book deals and the marketing company, I think, takes the profit from that and plows it into his film company. And his film company tells stories that the world needs to hear, but the major networks and television production companies aren't going to do it. As an example, most people have heard about the Underground Railroad. He went down to Venezuela, and I think Tony Robbins went with him this time, and he had to put on a flak jacket because of all the danger there. And they filmed what was happening with all these terrible situations with child kidnapping and so forth. And so he tells those kinds of stories just because he thinks they ought to be told. Second one I'd recommend is a woman by the name of Rochelle Schultz, who is the CEO of Winona Health. I've known Rochelle for 20 years. I've been on her board. And I'll tell you what, you don't want to talk about a complicated job. I mean, my job's a piece of cake. Anybody could do my job, right? But her job is so complicated in the healthcare environment because of all the government regulation and the shortage of physicians, you name it. And she does it spectacularly well. She's a very progressive, very enlightened leader. And she leads an organization of, I don't know, a couple of thousand people and hundreds of millions of revenue. And she'd definitely be worth talking to because she's got insight and viewpoints that most other people don't have.
Well, those both sound like great guests of yours. So I look forward to potentially having them on the show as well. So thank you
Good.
for that, Steve. All that experience that you've accumulated and you've really, as it were, been through the school of hard knocks and learned a lot on the way. There's very little, I think, that you haven't seen. But what experiences and upbringing, when you were a kid, have shaped the leader that you become today and the CEO that you have been and that you currently are?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've worked in a lot of organizations, big mega corporations and small kind of startups and everything in between. And I would say, Jonathan, is you learn by watching what other people do. Generally, you either read books, you go to classes, you watch what other people do, and you either decide that's a good thing to do, I think I'll do it, or that's really not a good thing to do and I won't do it at all. And what I found is I would say out of I probably worked for 20 leaders in my career, roughly, and seen another 30 or 40, whatever. And I would say out of those 20 leaders, only about four of them were what I would call terrific leaders, inspirational, insightful, and all that kind of stuff. And the rest of them they were just horrible. They were just really, bad leaders. And so I learned not only what to do from the best of the best, I also learned what not to do from the rest of them. And you have to have both of those in your experience, because otherwise you do dumb things because you didn't realize it was dumb things unless you lived through it like I did. And so you have to have, kind of the balance there between what's not so good and what's good. And I've been fortunate enough to see a lot of both situations.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I'm like you. I can look back both in my business 20 years and my military 20 years, um, that I've had some very, very fine leaders. General the Lord Dannatt, you know, um, Brigadier John Griffin, General John Stokoe, very fine personal example, brave leaders, been given all sorts of awards and led personally, military cross and various things like that for Richard Dannatt. And then I've had some very selfish, egotistical, narcissistic leaders, both in business and outside. Now, I noticed, Steve, that you've got a very interesting ring on your right hand. What is the story behind that ring?
It's not all that interesting. It's just my master's degree in business administration.
Okay. From where?
This is from Regis University.
Okay.
And the interesting thing about, if there is anything interesting about it, I didn't get my master's degree until I was 52.
I like that.
I
Yeah.
didn't get my bachelor's degree until I was 40.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. I'm right behind that because my wife, and she will remain ageless, she's just about to do a 2-year MBA herself.
Is she?
And it's later on, but she is the CEO of a charity which helps the victims of violence against women and girls called the Inspiring Leadership Foundation. And she's such an inspiration, but she wants to have that additional skill set by doing an MBA that really helps her run the charity well, dealing with the board and all that kind of stuff. So, well done you for getting that. So, coming back to you and your experiences, you know, you've done a phenomenal amount of things, but who was it that shaped you? Was it mother? Was it father, grandfather, parents? I mean, grandmother? Who really gave you the kind of values you have and was a bit of a role model to you? Or, like you were saying with the leaders, who was it that was just like so bad you didn't want to be like them and you determined to make something of your life?
Yeah. My mother was a waitress and my father was a truck driver. And
Right.
so I grew up in a blue collar family, and they worked all the time. I mean, they just worked all the time. They grew up in the Depression, and so they have a different lens than other people do on the world. And I learned the value of hard work from both of them, and I learned the value of having empathy for people who don't have what you have from both of them. They could barely eat during the Depression. So, my mother used to just save. Oh, she'd a can of spam. She'd never throw it away. Just hang on to it because you don't know when you're going to need it again. And I would say that was sort of the fundamental. And then I went into the Navy for 4 years right out of high school
Right.
because my parents couldn't afford to send me to college and I didn't have the money to do it either. And in those days, there was a lottery for the draft, and I would have been drafted if I didn't join. But anyway, in the Navy, 4 years in the Navy, I rose to a considerable rank for an enlisted man. I learned a whole lot about discipline, commitment. You got to do this whether you like it or not. And so often today, Jonathan, I'm sure you'll agree with this. Younger people say, that's too hard. I don't like that. I don't no, so I'm just not going to do that anymore. I'm going to quit. But quitting was not an option when you were, as you know, in the service. And so I would say that formed the fundamental. And then when I went to work for a company called Allen Bradley, you may have heard of them. They're an industrial control manufacturer, very big one. Now they're owned by Rockwell International.
Rockwell, I know. Yeah.
Yeah, and I got really lucky because I started there as a factory supervisor, and they put me in one of their leadership development programs. And Allen Bradley at the time was absolutely known for their world-class leadership training programs and their world-class attitudes about how to treat people. I'll give you an example. Harry Bradley, the founder of the company, it was $1 billion company, and his apartment used to be on the top floor of the factory in Milwaukee. He'd walk around the factory at midnight, and this is the kind of role models we had. Walk around the factory at midnight to talk to the workers, not to see if they were working, but just to make sure that they were treated well.
Wow.
So I was lucky because that's what my original foundation and leadership was all about.
Yeah, well, I mean, two things strike me from that. Firstly, the Navy, which you might not be able to see, but at the back of the room is my father's Navy cap. He was a commander in the Fleet Air Arm, the fast jet pilots, and
Oh,
he was killed when I was two, but saving the lives of two other naval pilots, which is a whole story in itself. But that Navy upbringing that you had for those 4 years must have been very powerful. And secondly, Rockwell, which has one of the best leadership development training programs in the world, is of the sort of caliber to also my time being taught. I'm going back as an instructor at the Royal Military Academy Santos, which is seen as one of the best leadership development programs in the world as well on the same par. I think those things never leave you. And I was just wondering, in your time in the Navy, what rank did you reach, and what kind of things did you do? Did you serve in a particular place all the time, or did you move around a bit?
yeah, I was what they call E5 was the rank that I left with.
Hmm.
Uh, that's an enlisted rank. It's like E1's as soon as you get out of boot camp, and E5. And I worked in the engine room.
Hmm.
And by the time I left, I was designated as the engineering officer in charge of the watch, which no enlisted man had ever gotten before.
Mm.
And I was on the same ship for 3.5 years. Traveled, down to Gitmo, Cuba, in the Mediterranean 2 or 3 times, North Atlantic. We were always at sea, 8 months at a time. And so you sort of learn to just sort of deal with what you have and make the best of it. And I had two people on that ship who were above me. One was a first class who was just a terrific guy, great leader, liked him a lot. And then the guy above him was a complete and absolute jerk, absolute jerk. And so you talk about a contrast in two different leadership styles. Now, the guy at the top obviously got there for some reason. We can only wonder what. And so they sort of balanced each other out in a sense. But anyway, on that ship, I saw two different types of leadership styles. And I'm not sure I could have assessed the impact on other people, but I knew what the impact was on me.
Yeah, and it's interesting you touch on that. And I've often found when you've got a poor leader above you, it takes a certain kind of leader to protect those below you from all their narcissism, selfish, idiotic ideas that they might have that will please somebody else and get them promoted.
Right.
What did the guy above you do that you so admired about him in the way that he was still respectful of the one above, but he looked after you and the others?
Well, you said it right. He looked after me and the others. I mean, that guy was always there. He wasn't a critic. If you weren't doing something right, he didn't say, this is all wrong. What's wrong with you? He'd say, hey, let me show you how to do it. And he had people under his leadership that were just brand new to the Navy, didn't know anything about the ship. The guys like me near the end had been on the ship for 2 or 3 years. So he took the kind of approach of kind of helping everybody out. And he saw, you want to talk about servant leadership? That's sort of the way he
Mm,
was.
mm. I think servant leadership is still, I mean, as you know from all the work you've done, the books you've read, your MBA, there are thousands of different styles of leadership. But
Yeah.
I think that the fundamental concept of serve to lead, which was the motto for the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, that officers eat last, Simon Sinek took up that caption. And this idea of you wouldn't expect your men to do anything that you weren't prepared to do yourself.
Right.
And just like your boss with his penthouse suite above the factory, as the officer of the duty, you remember this, that you'd go out at 2 in the morning and check how people are getting on and have a bit of a conversation with the guy who's on
Yep.
duty but probably about to fall asleep, and you just keep him going and just check how his family is and what's going on.
Yep.
Those kind of things are very special, that last with you clearly, Steve,
Yep.
to all the different CEO jobs you're doing now. So thinking back to those young days when you were there, knowing all the things you've learned, Steve, in the many different jobs you've done since then, what advice would you give to the young Steve Blue that actually is still timely advice from young people aged 16 to 18 today, that this matters and this doesn't? What, from all the wisdom you've had, all the experiences.
Well, I would say a couple things. One, do the hard jobs. I tell young people this all the time when they say, how'd you get to be a CEO? Okay. How much time do you have? Do the hard jobs. When I first started at Rockwell, anybody can look around any organization and find all kinds of things wrong. That's just life. I'd find things wrong and then I'd offer to go fix them. And it was the crappiest, dirtiest, rottenest assignments on the face of the planet in crappy little dirty towns I'd have to move to. And after a while, I got known as a troubleshooter. And so then the divisional general managers would ask for me. I want Blue to come here and fix this problem. And because of that, Jonathan, I learned about every part of an organization. I was in marketing, I was in sales, I was in engineering, I was in accounting. And so I learned everything that's wrong can go wrong in any part of the organization. And through trial and error, admittedly, I learned how to fix it. And so now, as a CEO, when there's something going wrong in the organization, you can't fool me. I've been there, I've been around, and that'd be my advice to young people: go do the crappy, lousy jobs. And the ones, most of them that I did, Jonathan, nobody else wanted to touch. The big shots at corporate didn't want to touch it. And until later on, when I got a reputation as being a pretty terrific superstar troubleshooter, nobody wanted to do anything that I was doing. And that'd be my advice to young people.
Yeah, well, it's probably a name you might remember, and I was brought up on him, but probably people today might not have ever heard of him. But there's a guy. Do you remember the guy Red Adair, who was sent in
Oh, yeah.
to cap oil wells whenever there was a trouble and an oil well fire was burning?
Right,
He'd
right.
bring
Yeah, I
in
remember
Red
that.
Adair. Red
Yeah,
Adair
right
would
there. Yeah.
sort it out. So you were the Steve Blue was the Red Adair of the industry, and then. In all the good times and the bad times, I find many leaders learn the most from their darkest hour, from something in their personal life that went wrong and that taught them an awful lot. I've certainly had a lot of things that gone wrong in my life that I've learned a huge amount from, or in business. Which would you pick as a dark moment for you, and what did it teach you?
Well, the darkest moment would be when I was, the darkest moment would be when I was in a turnaround. And I hadn't participated in a turnaround before. And the reason I took the job was I was a mid-level manager at Rockwell International. At some point in time, I could do better than that, but my boss was pretty capable and he wasn't going anywhere. And I got a call from a headhunter. I want to go to work for a turnaround as a vice president. And so I said, yep. And I had no idea what I was walking into. Really, I had no idea. And when I told my father-in-law about it, who was in business for all of his life, he said, that's the worst idea I ever heard of. Don't do it. Well, I got into that. I was in that turnaround for 7 years, and it was so dark, Jonathan, that we had to decide whether to pay the light bill or to pay payroll on a weekly basis. It was just an absolute mess. And when you get into a situation like that where you're losing money left and right, it ends up being a very toxic environment. And then the company got bought by an Italian company, and they way overpaid it. And then the pressure came down a lot harder to produce results. And so, two things I learned from that experience. One was cash is king. So you better always know where your cash is. And even today, Jonathan, especially today, every single day, I know what our cash position is. Every single day, I know what our orders were. Every single day, I know what our shipments were. And people say, well, you got people to do that. And I do. But I learned in a turnaround, especially big corporations, it's like they're playing Monopoly or they're playing with funny money. It's like, it's not my money. It's just like a thing on a balance sheet. And when you get into turnaround, you realize business is about real money.
Mm.
And the darkest part of that was when I left because they eliminated my position and laid me off. And I didn't do anything wrong. It's just, the Italians came in, they said, we don't need him. We didn't. My whole division got wiped out. And I learned from that you can be wiped out when you're not in charge. Some pinhead above you can really destroy your life. And so I vowed then never to let anybody be able to do that to me. But anyway, when they took me out, I had two little kids, a mortgage, a ton of bills, and I would wake up in the middle of the night with night sweats and nightmares and not knowing what to do, not knowing which way to turn. And that was probably the darkest. I've had a lot of dark spots in my career, but that's not a big deal. Everybody does. You learn from those, but that's probably the darkest.
Gosh, and I know that when I've had moments in my business career or even my military career where wasn't going so well, and I feared for my job and my future, and would they keep me or was I going to be made redundant? That it does really close you down. You're not thinking well.
No,
It's this fear, which encourages to overcome fear, but it does make it, almost like the blinkers come on like a horse in those olden days, that you can just see almost like dead ahead, try and do this next job rather than thinking bigger and wider and how you can
right,
see that. Do you not
right.
find that?
In fact, for months, the rumors were all over the company, and I'd hear them that I was going to get whacked. For
Yeah.
months, I kept hearing that, and of course, it was true. And that kind of environment, like you said, it's like, how can I do my job when I'm worried about getting whacked today? And when are they going to whack? You know how they did it? The general counsel. I was in China at our joint venture, and then she called me. And I'm in China, and she calls me to tell me I'm out of a job. You couldn't wait 4 or 5 more days for me to get home, for Christ's sake. And that just, that's kind of the way big companies work.
Yeah, well, someone once said to me that corporates, those big corporates, they have a legal identity, but they have no heart and they have no soul. And
Uh,
so by definition, that is psychopathic. So corporations, by their design, are psychopathic. They don't care about the individual. They
no, they
they
don't.
they just have their legal identity and make sure that the shareholders get what they want, or whoever has got a deal in it, or the owners, or whatever it is. And people are literally resources, which is why I do hate that term, human resources. It's just
Oh,
they're
yeah.
just like human remains. As someone unfairly calls HR. But it needs to be, people, the chief people officer. That you're just not shuffling chess pieces around the board. These are people with lives, and in your case, 2 kids and bills to pay, and
Yeah.
having night sweats. No, I really relate to that, and that really comes on nicely. We'll just do a trip around the Inspiring Leadership Compass because it's based on what makes inspiring leaders like you and high performers. But the first one is linked to that. It's this thing about integrity. That leader of yours didn't act with integrity. They rang you in China. They told you in China. They didn't have the courage to talk to your face.
Right.
The redundancy programs are the most difficult. And I once um, lacked the courage to tell a couple of very difficult characters. They were associates, coaches, rather than full-time employees, that we weren't going to be using them anymore. And there was another lady who said she'd do it for me. She was in sort of in the HR team, but really it wasn't her job. It was my job,
Yeah.
and I know I ducked it. And then later on, I met one of the guys. We were at the urinals together. You couldn't imagine a more awkward place to meet someone. And he goes, "Hello, Terminator." And I went, "Oh, hi there. Nice to meet you." And I just thought I felt quite a heel, to be honest. Um, and from that moment, I vowed that when there's a difficult conversation to be had about somebody's future, you have to look them in the eye and you have to say, "Look, I'm really sorry. This is not working out for you or for me. And
Yep.
I want to help you find your happiness elsewhere, but it's not going to be here."
Right.
And you have to, having been through the process of, I don't know, get well programs or all sorts of things, where you give them a chance or you give them a coach to help raise their game, but don't play with them. I had one very senior with a very famous American brand name, um, HR director, and he said, Jonathan, will you coach this person? It's one of his VPs. And I said, okay, what's the plan for him? Promotion or anything? He said, no, I want to get rid of him. I said, why are you coaching him? Oh, well, it would be cheaper for us if you get him to work it out for himself.
Oh, for
And
God's sake.
and I said, no, David, I won't do that. I will coach you to have the courageous conversation, but
Right.
I'm not going to do your dirty work for you. You're
Nope.
not going to use
Nope.
me as some silent tool to save you money. You're going to have this conversation with them, and you're going to have to explain to them why they're no longer required or what it is you expect from them. But I think a lot of times, and I was clearly an example of that myself, people don't like difficult conversations. We try and
No.
avoid them, don't
No.
we? So we want to be popular, we want to be nice, but
Mhm.
actually respect is much more valued. And I think when I look back, it was some of the toughest conversations I had, like again, General Lord Dannett when he was my commanding officer and I was a major. And he said, Jonathan, you're too competitive with your peers. You really are very intense with it. You have to build relationships with your peers. I know they're your competitors to potentially be commanding officer one day. It's going to be you or them, but equally, you're going to have to get on with them and
Yep.
don't just see it as a competition, dog eat dog, zero sum game. You got to work together for the benefit of the regiment.
Yep.
And I thought, wow, that's tough feedback, but it was very true and very relevant. Integrity. What is your top tip about integrity for people? It's so important.
Well, that's one of our company values that I created a number of years ago, many, many years ago. If you don't have integrity, you don't have anything. And it's not only you can take me at my word. It's not only that. It's how you behave on a day by day basis and what you do on a day by day basis. Because if people look at the leader and he doesn't have integrity, how do you expect them to have it? Because they're basically just going to mirror your behavior. Now, I'll give you an example. I remember one time I bought this, I wrote about this in one of my books. I bought a 1968 cherry red Mustang convertible. And it had a white top on it. And I just love that car. When I was a kid, I couldn't afford that car. And then so I'm fine. And so I bought it and I decided that when the winter was coming that I would park it in our warehouse. It was a heated warehouse, right? And so I brought it into the warehouse, and then I'm walking down the factory, and we have banners above, and one of them says integrity. And I thought to myself, I said, now I can do this. I'm the CEO. I can do any damn thing I want, right? I can put this car in the, and I'm thinking, would a CEO of integrity park his personal car over the winter in the company space as opposed to taking it somewhere and paying for it? And I said, no, I wouldn't do that. And that's just one. And then because people would know that I parked my car in the company space and didn't pay for it, everyone would know that. And nobody would think, oh boy, isn't that great? He's got a 65 Mustang and he's got it in the warehouse. And then that sort of issue permeates throughout the organization. And then if the leader doesn't have integrity, nobody else will either. We actually fired a guy one time in the tool and die room because he was cheating on his numbers of what he produced, right? It wasn't big cheating, but it was cheating. And that was very much in congruence with our company values of one, integrity.
Yeah, I think, I've known a lot of the leaders I've worked with and in my own life when my integrity is lacking, it's just everything begins to go downstream. You just
Yep.
like, where is the boundary? There's no boundaries.
Right.
You've not driven a hard line. And I know now that I feel so much better when I live with integrity to my values or the values
Yep.
of what I'm espousing. Because people often say one thing but they then do another. And kids, of course, they don't learn what the parents say; they learn what the parents do, and
Right.
it's the same in a business. And I remember the story about Truman, and he was writing a letter to his sister, I think it was, when he was president, and he got out some of his own stamps to put on. They said, "No, Mr. President, we'll put on one of the the White House stamps." No, this is a personal letter between me and my sister.
Yep.
I'll use one of my own. I'll pay for this myself. And there's small things, But someone described it as TNT, tiny noticeable things. These
Mhm.
little things like you parking the Mustang or not in the factory. Could everybody else do that? No, they couldn't. It was just the CEO was doing that.
Right,
And
right.
you spotted yourself, you caught yourself doing it, and you realized it was not right. Love that example. Let's give me another example, if you would, on purpose. Purpose and meaning. It's like, your why you do what you do. What gives your life meaning and purpose now, Steve? And what kind of example would you give when somebody else is trying to work out what is their purpose? Why are they going to do what they're going to do?
There's lots of advice out there about that. Lots of purposeful ways to discover your purpose. The way I discovered it was it just sort of happened. I mean, when I got out of the Navy, I didn't think I'm going to be a CEO one day, and I'm going to be a professional speaker, and I'm going to be a best-selling author. I had no idea, but I did know that I wanted to look forward to being quite successful, but I didn't know what. And so it was purely by accident that I went to work for Rockwell. It was a really stroke of good luck that they hired me. And then I sort of learned as I went through what leadership was all about. And I can tell you this, in my case, early on in my career at Rockwell, I was actually in human resources and I didn't like it. I was probably in human resources for 3 or 4 years. Don't ask me how. Oh, I know how I got it because I started from a factory supervisor and I thought, correctly so, the human resource people got more power and make more money than the factory supervisors do. So I want to go over there. And then after a couple of years of human resources, I got tired of telling the leaders, the line guys, what to do. I got tired of cleaning up their messes because, like you said, they were afraid to confront people. They wouldn't give accurate feedback. And then they go, I remember one guy always come in my office. He goes, oh, I'm going to hand you a medium-sized hand grenade. And finally, I said, John, when you leave my office, the hand grenade is still with you. I'm not. So then I decided I can't deal with this anymore. So that's when I decided I needed to get a line job, and then I sort of worked up the ladder with different companies in those line jobs. So my purpose sort of discovered me, and then one day, Jonathan, I'm writing my first book. I'm sitting at the laptop. This is 20 years ago, and my wife's looking over my shoulder, and she says, "What are you doing?" I said, "Nothing." She goes, "No, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm writing a book." She goes, "You don't know anything to write a book about." And she just thought that was quite funny. And so then I started discovering that the way to get my message out, because this, some things that leaders do are so galactically stupid, just so galactically stupid. So then I started proliferating my views, which, as you can tell, are quite strong and opinionated to any leader who would read or listen to them through my so I sort of my purpose discovered me.
Mm. It is an interesting one, and there's the famous commencement address by the late Steve Jobs, where he said that you don't join the dots up looking forward, you join them up looking back over your life, and you go, oh, that led to that, which led to that, which is why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Right.
Um, and I think that's pretty fair. I mean, I look back to a seminal moment when I met my father's navigator, whose life he'd saved, and the pilot who died in the aeroplane. Oh, who stayed alive because my father died testing his aeroplane, and the blade came off on this other pilot's turbine as it was going around and cut through the airplane, caused the fire. Father got the co-pilot out, but then his ejection seat misfired and sent him into the tailpiece and killed him. And so meeting these guys and talking with them was the moment when I found my life purpose, because I'd actually called them together, this group of pilots who'd served with my father some years later, 30 years after he'd been killed, and said, look, I want to know more about the father I never knew, because here I am at Santos and I've had an outstanding career up to this point, and now I've just had an average report. Like, I'm average compared to my peers here. These are the best instructors from every regiment in the British Army,
Mhm.
and most of them are much better than me. And I've had a pretty average report, and I clearly need to learn from the best and pass on those tips to other people. And so that was the moment when the navigator, the observer, Commander Bill White, said, John, you have a choice. You can be a victim, poor me. your dad was killed when you were 3 and 2, and your mum brought up 3 boys on her own with very little money, and you'd moved out of it, a little caravan on the runway to no longer be guests of the Navy. You had to make it on your own with a very small, tiny Navy pension. He said, you can be a victim, or you can make your father's inspiration and what he did to save my life and Bill's life over here, your inspiration, and your mother, who's a philanthropist with little money, she's helping others. They can be your inspiration, and go out and find other people and learn from them and pass on what they've learned. And that
Yeah.
became my life calling. But it was really only looking back now as it began to soak in. And maybe at first, I don't know about you, but I often don't hear the message at first. And often, normally it's from my wife, Lee. She'll give me some great wisdom. And
Yeah.
then like about 3 months later, I go, darling, I've got this really good idea. She said, excuse me, I think I told you that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah, maybe you did, but no, I've
Yeah.
just heard it from this other person, this
Yeah.
guy, Steve Blue. He's so clever, and he told me these things, darling.
Mhm.
I told you that. Oh yeah, yeah, okay, fair go, fair go. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, we don't often attribute it right, but I think I was lucky in that sort of looking back, joining the dots up, that became the moment. I think it was Mark Twain said, two most important days in your life: the day you were born and the day you found out why. And that
Yeah.
was my why day. Um, so was there a moment in your life? I know you said you moved from, onto the HR and then onto a line job, and your put have discovered you. But looking back now, if you could have joined the dots up, do you think there was a pretty seminal moment? Maybe not at the time, but you look back, that was quite a key pivotal moment for you, a sort of sliding doors moment.
Yeah. I'd be hard pressed not to say it was the turnaround, but we kind of covered that ground already. But then after the turnaround, I took a couple of really big risks. All right, I was out of the job after the turnaround. I had a parachute. It wasn't a long parachute, but it was like 6 months and all that. And I had an important decision to make by joining a magazine in my industry as the publisher, which I knew nothing about that, but I knew people in the company and all that. I was, I never like to take a step back from compensation, even if you're out of a job. You just don't like to do it. But I took a pretty big pay cut to take this position, and I took it because I knew if I was the publisher of the biggest trade magazine in my industry, I would know everybody. Everybody would know me. I could call any CEO in the business, and he'd grant me some time and so forth. And so that was a big, big, big risk. And that's what led me to the job that I currently have. It was those contacts that I get called. And actually, when they called me the first time, I'd only been with the magazine for about a year, and I knew the owner, and I promised him a certain amount of time. So I said no. They made an offer to me for this position. I said no because I promised him I wouldn't leave for a certain period of time. And then they hired a guy, and he didn't work out too well, so they had to fire him. And then they called me back about 6 months later, and well, they made me an offer that I couldn't refuse at that point in time. But I remember, and I'm sure you've been through this, Jonathan. It's a little small town in Minnesota. Right? It's a beautiful. I love this town. Brought my wife here when we're doing the interview process. Show her around. She goes, "Don't you dare try to move me to that little podunk town." We lived in Chicago, Milwaukee, and I said, "Look, when you have a shot to get a CEO job, you get it. I don't care if it's in Timbuktu, Alaska. You just take it. We'll be here for 3 years, and then we'll move to Chicago. I'll get a bigger CEO job and all that kind of stuff." Fast forward 26 years, and if I told her we were moving for a different job, she'd go, "Well, have a nice life. Call me every now and again." So, so you never know, what life is going to unfold for you. And this was a little podunk town. Now I'm very heavy into it in philanthropy and and leadership positions, and I just absolutely adore this town. So you never know where you're going to end up, and it might be the best thing that ever happened to you.
I think it sounds a lovely story. And what is the name of your town?
Winona, Wino, just
Yeah,
like Winona Ryder, Winona, Minnesota.
yeah, and Wino. And is that the same Winona that's Winona Health?
Yes.
That's fantastic. Okay,
Yep.
love it. And we'll talk about philanthropy later on. Let's talk about health while we're talking about health.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think among the leaders that I've got to know over the years that health quotient, as we call it, mental, physical, or brain health, and well-being is such an important aspect of leadership. Never was when you and I were growing up and we were younger. I know you and I, you're even more experienced than me, have more years on me than I do. But health wasn't really something we did. We saw the doctors smoking their Camel cigarettes,
And
telling us,
recommending them
yeah, I
too.
recommend Camel. They're the really
Yeah,
good thing for you,
yeah.
and we've just now got ultra processed food that everybody tells you, yummy, yummy, drink Coca-Cola, it's good for your health, and eat burgers.
Yeah.
They'll soon be going. Can you remember that they actually were
Oh yeah.
telling them to eat
Oh
ultra
yeah.
processed food? They couldn't understand
Oh,
why 92.3% of Americans were metabolically unhealthy, and they just didn't get
right.
the
And why
connection.
they don't believe doctors anymore.
Yeah, that's right. They believe it. But how do you keep yourself healthy? If you were going to give a tip, Steve, about mental health and physical health that served you well, and you're looking in great form, what would it be?
Well, first of all, I have a medical concierge that looks after my health.
Okay.
Uh, and, they keep all my records. Okay, fine. My records are with my primary care doc, fine. And the healthcare system in town, that's fine. But my medical concierge looks over my health. They have a team of advisors. Whenever I have an issue or a question or a concern, they can answer it. And when I have to have a procedure done, they can provide a second opinion. They can introduce me to other providers that I wouldn't be able to normally get into. And it's quite, well, some would say it's pretty cheap. It's, I don't know, probably $20,000 a year.
Hmm.
But I arguably am the most important asset in the company. Now, some people would say, oh, hell, the punch press machine is more important than him, but it's worth looking after. So I'm very, very careful about my health. I do extensive blood work testing every year. Everything you, in fact, I know what my vitamin, I don't have to take a multivitamin, Jonathan, because I know I'm deficient in vitamin E. So I take vitamin E. So I've had my vitamin levels tested. So it's something I take very, very, very seriously. One, for myself and my family, but two, I owe it to the shareholders.
Yeah. No, I'm delighted that you do that, and that health is such a key part. I'm very lucky that I've got a brother who was the president of British Plastic Surgeons, and so if he doesn't know the answer on some surgical issue, um, two of his children are also GPs, and so they've all been giving me advice over the
Somebody
years.
knows the answer.
And you just mentioning as a passing comment, as well as the hole punch operator, how many people work in your organization?
Somewhere north of 300.
Yeah, there's a lot of people, and do you know them all? Have you got to know them
I
all?
do.
I thought you might say that. Yeah,
Every now
because
and again, a new person will come along that I haven't met, and I see that they're new in the factory. So I just walk up and introduce myself. I'll tell you a quick story about that. We had a newer person. Her name is Sarah. Been with me for a couple of years now. We got robots and machines all over the place. So I walked out there, had never met her, and she's like over here grabbing this man, moving this part, and she is just like warp speed to get things done. And I was impressed by that. So I said, Sarah, I said, this is awfully impressive that you're moving here, here, and the other place. And she didn't know what to say. She was flabbergasted. She sent me, and this is so typical. She sent me an email later on today. She goes, I'm sorry that I reacted the way that I did, but no CEO has ever said that to me before. And so I get out there in the factory and throughout the office area, and I know every single person, and I value every single person, and they know that.
I love that. And that's what good leaders do. And when I was a company commander, I had about 150 men, and I knew them all and their lives and their families. I took it as a personal challenge to know everything I could about them, so that when they were down or out, it wasn't just because Manchester United lost in the game that evening. It was
Right.
maybe because they had a daughter who had special needs and she had some specific problems, or that grandmother had just died that weekend and someone else had told me, and I'd go and spend some time with them. And I think that is such an important thing. And many leaders have absolutely no idea what a lot of people go on in their lives. They don't know their names, and they go hello, or they don't even say hello to people. They'll walk through an office or a factory and they won't even acknowledge anybody. So lovely to hear that personal example. Emotional and social intelligence is another area. And one of those skills is listening well. Now, you are clearly, from our conversations, a very good listener. How do you advise others to listen well?
Well, if God wanted us to talk more, he wouldn't have given us two ears and one mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the difficulty. It's easy to listen, but it's hard to listen without building your thought and your response for how you're going to respond. And that's what most people do. They're not listening. Yeah, fine. But here's what I'm going to say about why you're wrong on this. And it's difficult, but you have to kind of suspend judgment on what the person is saying and just listen to it. Give your mind your mind is instinctively going like this, and you need to give your mind a respite and just hold back a little bit and I'll really think about this. I'll give you a good example. This is in the area of communications too. My partner, I have a joint venture in Brazil. I think I told you about that last time we were together. Roberto speaks halfway decent English, not that great, but halfway decent. I speak very little Portuguese. Whenever we talk about something that's important, talk about a good listener. Once I say, here's what I need to do, here's whatever, he will say, let me, and he says the same thing every time, let me be sure I understand you perfectly. Emphasis on the word perfectly. This is what I think you just said, so let me repeat it back to, is that what you actually said? And that's, I think, a good exercise for anybody. Just stop and make sure, ask them. Don't respond and react all the time, because guess what? Many people are probably smarter than you are. And it might be a good idea for you to hear what they have to say, really, without judgment.
Yeah, it's such a key skill. Everybody goes on, speakers courses, public speaking, but do they ever do, listening courses and public listening? No, they
Should.
don't.
Yeah, they should.
And we should. It's such a, particularly with your partner, your life partner that you spend your time with, that's where relationships go badly wrong because you've been listening hard at work. Then you go home and you go, what?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. You want a
I know
fur coat?
exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. We all have to work hard on that one. Differences now. CQ is collaborative and cultural intelligence. How do you recommend people get on best with people who are very different from them? We see in America and in Britain a lot of racism, a lot of polarization. Even if you're a Democrat and I'm a Republican, I'm not going to speak to you, because you're
Yeah,
wrong. There's so much polarization. And how do you advise people to get on with people who are very different from you? You've had experience of this from the Navy onwards.
yeah. If it's a matter of politics, forget it. You don't need to reconcile that. You just don't engage is my advice. Do not engage with someone who has a polarized political view because you can't win that one. Their mind's made up and so forth. But if you bring it back to the workplace, this is a great example. CEOs my age and maybe even a little younger can't understand why what is it called, the Generation X or Generation Z or whatever it is, the young people, they just get beside themselves. They can't understand why these people want to do a 4-day work week, and I can't understand why they don't like this. I can't understand. Well, by God, when I was their age, I worked my tail off. That's not solving the problem. That's because they need to listen to that generation, and they have to deal with that generation because guess what? They're here to stay, and they have views on how things. So you don't just say, okay, do whatever you want. I don't care. This is a free love company. I'm not suggesting that, but you have to understand where they are and you have to sort of meet them halfway because just because you're old doesn't mean you're right.
Definitely the case. No, I love that one. Um, the next one round is resilience. And Steve, you've had to show great resilience, particularly when you went through those dark 7 years where just the money was so tight, you didn't know whether to keep the lights on or whether to pay people or where the next, dollar was coming from. And cash is king was a big lesson from there, as well as, what is it, Churchill, when you're in the middle of hell, just keep going. But sometimes there's the Groucho Marx comment, which if at first you don't succeed, give up. Don't be a bloody
Well,
fool.
yeah.
Don't be a bloody fool. Um, Resilience and coping with adversity. Do you think at times, you know, how important has your resilience been? And at other times, how pig-headed have you been when perhaps you should have admitted that it wasn't working, whatever you're doing?
Well, if I'd ever been wrong, I guess I could comment on that. Just kidding. Just kidding. I'll give you a couple examples, right? You can't ever hit a home run if you don't take a swing. So I take lots of swings, and out of all of the initiatives, major initiatives, that cost money and all that, that I've done, I'd say only about 70% of them work, and 30% of them were really failures. Some point in time, and it's pretty easy in business when you look at the numbers to decide if an initiative can't be funded anymore as a failure. That's pretty black and white, if you will. But that doesn't stop me from taking a swing at the next ball, because if it did, the 70% that worked out well would have never come to pass. And so I tell CEOs all the time, don't be afraid to make a mistake. You're going to make mistakes. Admit it when you've made a mistake. And when it's time to stop throwing money at, the so-called sunk cost syndrome, when it's time to stop throwing money at it, just stop throwing money at it. And if you're largely successful, nobody's going to hold that against you. And I'll give you an example. Many, many years ago, I started a trade show business in Mexico. I won't bore you with all the details of why I thought that could be successful. So, so I did that. I put $100,000 a pledge up of my own money that I didn't have, because you have to, guarantee the hotels for all these people that are supposed to come. And if they don't come, you're on the hook for $100,000. Okay, fine. I did that. I didn't have the money if it went south. Well, it almost went south because of a factor that was completely beyond my control. I'd planned for everything, but something happened. Anyway, at the last minute, everything turned out okay, and it was an enormous success, And so now I'm thinking, I'm a pretty smart guy. I started a business in a foreign country. I could do it again, so I tried to do start a broadcasting company in Cuba, which I'd been to before and I kind of knew fairly well. And that one was an absolute complete failure. And so I tell people all the time, a lot of times your failures are born out of the seeds of success. And a lot of times, most times your success is born out of the seeds of failure. So you really shouldn't be afraid to do either one of them.
Yeah, I love those stories, and I think these real examples really help people listening around the world. And there's about 123 different countries that people are listening to you, so thank you for that. Brand quotient, reputation, image, what people say about you when you're not in the room, Steve. How do you learn from 360 feedback? What kind of 360 feedback have you received over the years?
Oh boy. When I was at Rockwell, they had a place that we used to call Charm School. And I think it was in Greensboro, North Carolina, the Center for Creative Leadership. And so what they would do is they, have you fill out a bunch of psychological profiles and psychological tests before you went to Charm School. And then they had all your peers, your superior and people below you filled out, here's what we think of this guy. So you talk about 360, you get lots of 360, right? So then you get to Charm School and you're interacting with other middle management types and who are going through the same thing. And then the shrinks are watching you and your interactions every day with these other people. And so by the end of the thing, we had a binder. I used to keep it till I couldn't bear to look at it anymore. A binder this big that said what all my peers thought about me, not only at home, but also in this surrounding and Center for Creative Leadership, what the shrinks thought of me, what the tests thought of me, what I ought to be doing. And it was a pretty humbling experience because everyone has an image of what they're like and what people think about them. That image is probably wrong unless you actively seek feedback. And you know what? But nobody likes criticism. You say, what do you think of me, Jonathan? I want you to say, if you say anything other than you're a great guy, I will refute what you said. So especially leaders have to be humble enough to be able to accept that feedback and learn from it and change their behavior.
Yeah, it's so true. And what a great place to work with, the Center for Creative Leadership. I've heard of it many times.
Yeah,
It's produced lots of great materials, some research, and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, I'm a thoroughly big supporter of 360 feedback, including stakeholder-centered coaching, where on occasions I've done the deal where I don't get paid unless they improve according to the stakeholders who assess them at the beginning and will assess them 12 months later. Wow. It's a big risk to take, but if you're certain that you can actually help them improve their performance by the metrics that they're going to be measured, that's great. Legacy and stewardship, leaving things better than you found it. You mentioned already, Steve, that philanthropy is a big part of your life. It is for me and for my wife. We run a charity for I think I mentioned the victims of violence against women and girls. But tell us about how important you think leaving a legacy in your lifetime is.
Well, yeah, in terms of philanthropy, let me just start there. I've done a lot in this community, mostly in this community. A smaller community, you can really have a big impact, a bigger impact than, just sending money to this organization or that organization nationwide. You never really get to see or know what your impact was. So I've kept it in our community. And then our company, I set a mission way back when to we provide about 6% of our profits to organizations, charitable organizations, philanthropy all around the community, and healthcare, and education, and Habitat for Humanity. Organizations can have a pretty big impact, and I was happy to do that. It seemed like the right thing to do, even though before I got here, the company didn't do any of that. They weren't interested in any of that. And my philosophy, Jonathan, besides being the right thing to do, we earn our living in this community, so we should give back to our community. And at the same time, when we're hiring people, we attract a certain kind of person that's interested in that and is impressed by that. And those kind of people tend to be kind of better employees, more committed employees. And so it kind of works both ways. And but I'll give you an example. One time I'm in a grocery store, and the guy at the checkout says, "I want to thank you for everything you do in the community." I didn't even know the guy.
Wow, that's a lovely touch. That's a lovely, and thank you for what you do. We're just in the last couple of minutes. Want to cover executive teams and toxic turnaround and favorite book, and then we'll do the top tips. So, how, if there was one big tip you'd give people listening to turning around a toxic team they've discovered in their organization, what would you advise?
Well, you're very likely going to have to replace some or all of them, because the chances are they've been a toxic team for a long time, long before you ever got there. And the leopard doesn't change its spots. You give them an opportunity, you assess them, you be very frank with them, and so they understand where you're coming from and why it's important. And then you give them a short leash. And if they don't do what you want, kind of turn themselves around, then you end up, and I've done this. I've had very little success in changing a toxic team's behavior that has been in place for decades. Very, very little success. And so I've ended up, in most cases, replacing them one at a time for the kind of people that I want. And that's what kind of worked for me.
Yeah, no, good advice. Thank you very much indeed for that. Um, you mentioned as a favorite book Unlimited Power by Tony Robbins. So I think that's a well-known book. I'll leave that one on it. Let's go on to the 2 minute top tip. So Steve, would you be good enough to introduce yourself? Tell us what you're doing now as the CEO, and give us your top leadership tip. And that would finish us off nicely.
Yes, I'm Stephen Blue. I'm the CEO of a high-tech company called Miller Ingenuity, and I'm also a five-time best-selling author and a professional speaker. I would say ordinary leaders cling to the past. Extraordinary leaders create the future. That may sound like a cliche, but if you don't want to change anything because the past was good and you're satisfied with the past and you like the past and you're comfortable with the past, you're going to fail in the turbulence of the coming wars on business.
Fantastic advice. Well, look, Steve, I've really enjoyed learning from you, and I hope we really stay in touch in the future. Thank you very much for being on the Inspiring Leadership podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.